Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Dez. I'm your host, Dez Blanchfield. And today, in the studio with me, I have Stephen Dickens. Now, Stephen Dickens, you're the Global Offering Manager for the Z Cloud, as they say in the North American, or Z Cloud in our world, at IBM. And you're based in Poughkeepsie in New York, USA. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Des. Great to be with you this afternoon.
Now, I should mention that we've caught up a couple of times, and in fact, I think the last time we caught up was in sunny old Las Vegas at the IBM Interconnect event, hanging out there.
Yeah, it was good to catch up there. It was a pretty wild event, but it was good. It was certainly good to catch up.
It was like 23,000 close and personal friends, but we had some great conversations around all the things that you do, which we're going to cover today. And I was fascinated by a number of key topics, which is why I've been so keen to get you in the studio, because I think there's some things that you're doing now that are groundbreaking in what people are trying to do in the world in general around cloud and containerization and big data and streaming analytics and Hadoop in a space that people might not normally expect it to be, and that is on the mainframe. But I think, why don't we kick straight into one of the key topics that this drives out of, and that is cloud in general, and then we'll sort of walk through your open mainframe project and then the Linux One project, and then we'll talk about mainframe in general. When people think about cloud, they don't tend to think about mainframe, do they?
No, they don't. I mean, I think the industry's kind of obsessed with cloud equals AWS, cloud equals, Rackspace, it equals Amazon, it equals Google, and it's by definition x86 or sort of Windows, Linux-based workloads. Whereas I see it certainly a broader definition than that, and computing in the cloud for me is more a destination than a particular technology.
Right.
So we're seeing people wanting to move off-premise, move into multi-tenant architectures, move to a more consumption model, and they're wanting all of those inherent benefits of a cloud computing model, but they're wanting to do that with their mainframe in the same way that they want to do that with on-premise x86 workloads and move those to the cloud. They want to do the same with mainframe workloads and move those to the cloud. So I think for me, cloud's a broader term than maybe the industry sees it is. And when we certainly approach senior leaders and say, we'd like to support your cloud-first strategy and move you to a cloud model, there's sometimes some surprise there as we say, and yes, we mean that in the mainframe space.
Right. Well, your role as Global Offering Manager for the Z Cloud, in the context of all of that, maybe just give us some insight in kind of what that looks like, and even maybe just a quick background on yourself. I mean, how did you come to be at IBM, and how did you come to be in the space of mainframe, and then how did that transmogrify in many ways, because it's a sense of magic, into cloud, which aren't always naturally something we think about, as you said. Maybe just quick background on yourself and an outline of kind of what it means to be the Global Offering Manager for the Z Cloud.
Yeah, happy to do that. So really, sort of mainframe is bookends to my career, if you will. So I kind of left college, ended up working at Computer Associates for 3 years, kind of straight out into the world of mainframe computing, and had 3 very happy years at CA. Then moved into a world of distributed computing with HP, and then I've been at IBM these last 7 years. So the kind of mainframe's the beginning and end of, well, I hope not the end of my career. The point I'm at, maybe the point I'm at the moment,
the current pinnacle.
Yeah, the current pinnacle. So I think what the offering manager role means within IBM is you're really that owner of the business for that particular offering. There's lots of people in IBM who get up, who think about lots of different things. We've got obviously our senior leadership team who are responsible for different parts of our business.
Yeah.
But the offering managers within our organization are singularly focused on one thing, and they'll be focused on it from a development point of view, a go-to-market point of view, a sales, pricing, partner strategy, working with ecosystem partners, but for one solution area. So the offering manager role really makes you almost as, and some of us offering managers laugh when IBM describes it this way, but almost the general manager of a single business line.
Right.
So you get to experience everything from chatting to clients 1 minute, chatting to partners and business partners the next,
Yeah.
then jumping on with our finance team, and then the next minute you're down in the guts of service delivery and development of the offering. So it's a really broad church of responsibility. And I moved out of sales about 3 years ago in order to do this, just because I wanted to get that business overall perspective. And it's been a really exciting last 3 years working on some of the open technologies and really developing out our cloud proposition.
I can only imagine. And I like that phrase. I'm going to write that down, the broad church of responsibility. I'm going to steal that for my next talk.
You're welcome to it, Dez. You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm going to put it on some T-shirts for you and quote you. It seems to me like that pedigree you were talking about, excuse me, of Computer Associates, which from my experience was predominantly software focused, and then HP with distributed computing and hardware. That seems to me where you've got a really good background now in all the things you're talking about, where you've got the big iron over the mainframe platform, but really the magic is kind of the software inside it in many ways, because at the end of the day, hardware is only part of the puzzle, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's given me a perspective across all parts of the industry. It's been really interesting as we've moved into more into the Linux space with the mainframe and more into the cloud computing space, understanding and speaking fluent x86 and understanding and understanding. We were talking about containers. We're talking about what that means in an x86 world, and being able to translate that and bring that across over to the mainframe space.
Now, we were talking earlier about what it actually meant to have cloud on the mainframe. I'd like to just touch on that quickly, because when we think about mainframe, and in fact, you gave me a really good one-liner, which I'm going to use here, and that is that a lot of people think about mainframe and they think about legacy systems, they think about old big iron. But you had a really great line that I'm going to steal here, where you referred to the mainframe as essentially the equivalent of the Porsche 911, and that is that in 1964, when sort of mainframe became a thing and really hit the market some years ago, it was essentially the same year that the Porsche 911 came out. And you made a great comment around the fact that if you buy a Porsche 911 today, the only thing that's really the same as the Porsche 911 is the badge on the back of it. There are no old parts, no old software, no brake linings. And that's the same for the mainframe platform, in that is that it's not 40-year-old hardware, it's not 60-year-old software, it's not 100-year-old developers, is it? I mean, the mainframe today is on par, if not ahead in some ways, with other technology stacks such as the x86 and other platforms that we've seen come and go. Is that a fair comment?
Definitely. I mean, you look at some of the highlights from the technical spec sheet of the mainframe, 5 gigahertz processor. Yeah. I don't know of an Intel box running a 5 gigahertz processor, so, and that's the current machine. I have the privilege of working out of our Poughkeepsie labs, which is, pretty much the home of the mainframe, and I'm good friends with some of our hardware development engineers. What they've got planned for the next box, is going to be truly groundbreaking.
Right.
So
yeah.
I think, and when it frustrates us as we sit here in Poughkeepsie often, and we see the pictures where we talk about the mainframe, and the press will pick it up, and there's a picture from 1964 of a computer taking up an entire room with women with beehive haircuts and
mini skirts and
and that's the picture of the mainframe, and then the press will pick up that if there's any issues with the client, it'll be the 40-year-old mainframe was at the source of some of those issues. I don't know anybody running a 40-year-old mainframe.
No.
There's some customers on maybe 10 or 12-year-old mainframes, but I'd argue there's also people running, Windows 7 in production.
Well, look at the latest virus that's hitting the world, right? It's attacking machines that are predominantly, XP, for example, and airlines and banks and ATMs that are running this old software are being taken over or pwned, as they say, and then encrypted hard drives, and then a big red screen with a lock on it. Well, they have 15, 16-year-old operating systems.
Yeah, so I mean, you don't hear when Windows launched the new version of Windows 10, oh, this is a 30-year-old operating system.
Yeah, yeah.
But Windows has been around for 30 years. Yeah. So I think the mainframe, if people actually get past some of those sepia-toned kind of images and actually engage with our engineers and the people who are driving this platform forward. You know, I was talking to the guys today about APM technology. You was chatting to our ecosystem VP about what we're doing with Docker. You know, chatting to one of the guys over lunch about the projects he's doing with MongoDB. All of these are technologies that run on the mainframe. So get past, I think, some of the bias would be my and understand what the technology can actually do.
And it shouldn't be surprising to those. I mean, I think we were talking earlier. I mentioned that I was on stage recently at a government conference talking about some of the new technologies that are coming out, and I had the same frustration. And you know, I'm nearly 50. I'm getting old, and the kids on the stage were half my age, and I love their energy. I love their exuberance, but I kind of got cross with them away in front of a room full of people saying, look, you know, you haven't done any history. You haven't looked at where you've come from. All the stuff that you're talking about, whether it's MongoDB or Docker or Kubernetes or whatever, whether it's Spark or Hadoop or Cassandra, you know, you think that these are things that have just been around for the last year or so, and they haven't. They've been around for quite a while. But the technology stack, the operating systems, I mean, these didn't just happen the day you were born, you know. And they're always really surprised. And I sort of reverse it and look at them and say, well, I'm surprised that you're surprised, because why would you assume that just because some new database technology has come out a couple of years ago that it should only run on the new tin? Like, you know, and I always love the look on their face. But when we think about what we're talking about, it's forgivable in many ways that a lot of the sort of funky new technologies are seen as being only x86 cloud space, because that's essentially all they've known. Then when I look at a lot of these startups, they're what we call cloud natives, and in many ways the Azures and the AWSs are all they've known, and they generally don't broaden their wings and fly further, you know, and look at something like Z Cloud. But I think when we look at where the bulk of the heavy lifting's been done, it isn't Facebook and it isn't Twitter. It's you know, it's banking and wealth management and finance in general, insurance. You know, off the top of my head, I can think of like 10 things that sometimes just amaze these young developers when I say, well, when did you last build a banking system or a wealth management platform or some insurance business or an airline or flight management or booking system? Or when did you last re-engineer the entire platform for a state or federal government? Or show me the biggest retailer you've done with that isn't just, you know, selling toys on eBay, or medical systems or defense or transport, logistics and telco, and, you know, these really big enterprise workloads that, in my mind, I think, you know, they've been looking for cloud capability, but they've been on your platform for ages and as in decades, and they want to stay on that platform, but they're looking for the new great technologies. And surely that's where you're going with the Z Cloud, that you're giving them that capability for those not so much traditional, but those very big, heavy workloads that have needed some of the big iron. They're not going to just go and throw that in a public cloud, are they? They're looking for what you're hopefully providing, which is this big iron and workload platform that they've been used to for decades. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, people have got a lot of business logic built into their mainframe. They've, over those decades, codified their business into those applications, and those applications have therefore become very intrinsic to how those businesses function.
Yeah.
You know, you look at Sabre in the airline industry. You chat to some of the retailers about their supply and logistics. I had the pleasure of working with a UK retailer who's actually a public reference for us, so I can talk about it. Tesco's.
Okay.
What they do is they run their entire supply chain on the mainframe platform. So when that mainframe, if it was to go down, it would actually stop tins of beans going from the warehouse to going on the shelves. This isn't some cool web front end around some little promotion.
No.
It's tins of beans going from the warehouse to going onto the shelf. Now, that's maybe not sexy. It maybe doesn't grab the headlines.
It's not a funky 140-character tweet, is it? It's a 140-character SKU that sits on the shelf that mums and dads are buying to make dinner for some kid on Saturday.
But if you talk to the CTO or CIO of that business, what they're obsessed with is making sure that that tin of beans is there, always there, and that whenever I walk into a Tesco's, I can take that tin of beans, walk to the point of sale, and hand over my money. That's the fundamentals of a retail business. Well, those systems run on the mainframe for that business, and certainly lots of other businesses around the world.
And no one went broke because a Facebook post or a Pinterest post or a tweet didn't make it to the cloud. But certainly companies will go broke in that supply chain, because I think, when people talk about supply chains, they don't really understand the depth of what it means to go from stuff growing in the field, stuff being shipped to a processing plant, it being put into a tin, the tin being made and manufactured and shipped to the same processing plant, packed, sealed, a label being put on it, put in another box, put in another truck, shipped to a holding area, shipped to a wharf, then shipped to another country, and then put in another holding area, and then put into a warehouse, and then fulfilled into distribution, and then from distribution to the retail centers, and the retail centers to the stores, from the store warehouse into the shelf, from the shelf to you and going, picking it up and walking, and then the inverse of it, going from the shelf to the point of sale, and point of sale to a shopping bag to home to back on another shelf. That end-to-end process has to work every time, all the time, 24/7, right? And I think somewhere in the rush to this .com boom and sort of through the Web 2.0, sort of chasing unicorns, if you'll forgive the terminology, we kind of forgot which platform was actually powering some of the most mission-critical systems that have been in place for decades, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, another example would be banking. All of us now are very... I bank with a bank that the nearest branch is over 100 miles away.
Right.
I probably go into that branch 2 or 3 times a year maximum. All of my banking's done online, and 90% of what I do online, I do on my phone. So that's the sort of experience that people think, and they say, that's done on my iPhone, and then obviously that goes to the cloud somewhere, and that's where people's thought process stops of how me checking my bank balance is complete as a transaction.
Yeah.
What they don't realize is that there's a mainframe sitting behind both of those systems of engagement that's handling the system of record that says what's going on in my checking account.
Yeah.
What payments went out yesterday, what payments came in, and gives that balance update. And I would switch banks if I couldn't get to that information instantaneously.
Absolutely.
So,
and
24/7.
Yep.
I want to check my balance at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to check it 9 till 3:30 in banking hours. I want to check it every on a Sunday afternoon. I want to check it at 2 o'clock in the morning, just when I'm at an airport. I want to check it all the time, and that comes back to a mainframe platform that's got to run 24/7, 365.
And there's a level of high availability that comes with that. When you're talking about your background in CA and software, I mean, they built some of the biggest systems in the world. When you're talking about your background in distributed computing in HP, again, they built some pretty big pieces of tin. But a lot of the times the reference architecture that some of those projects and some of those firms used came out of the work that IBM had done in the mainframe space in just keeping things running all day and night. I did a bit of homework on kind of what we were going to cover just in the mainframe space, just to put some context in it, and I'm going to run it through it quickly because I and then maybe we'll jump into kind of the open mainframe project topic next. But as of today, 70% of enterprise data still sits on a mainframe apparently, and I've got a whole bunch of data to support that. Over 70% of the Fortune 500s globally run their core business systems on mainframe, and you say these things and people look at you if they're shocked because they've spent the whole day on Twitter and LinkedIn. 92 out of the top 100 banks in the world still run their core banking systems on mainframe. And, there's, as I say, and I keep saying mainframe, I think, every time I say that, people sort of probably have a negative connotation, but this is surely a positive thing. You talked about Tesco and the retailers. Well, it turns out that 23 out of the top 25 retailers on the planet still use mainframe. And they're not running 40-year-old software, right? And now here's the one that blew me away. Out of the top 10 insurance companies on the planet, and I actually called a couple of colleagues who are CEOs for some of those brands, and one in the UK, one in Europe, and a couple in Australia here. 10 out of 10 of the insurance companies that I could find in the top 10 are dedicated 100% running their insurance platform on mainframe, which just blew me away. That's 100% of them. And it goes on, I know in the US, for example, I saw a report recently where 225 out of the state and local government organizations in the US just wouldn't put anything anywhere other than mainframe. And it goes on and on. I mean, defense, you name it. Missile systems are not run by stuff running on public cloud, right? So there's a whole bunch of work on opening this platform up, and I know that you also head up and drive a whole bunch of activity around a topic called Open Mainframe. Maybe just give us a quick summary on kind of what Open Mainframe is and where it came from and what you're doing with it currently.
So Linux on the mainframe's been around since '99, but what we were seeing was just an explosion of open source. So if you look at the sort of first few years of Linux on this platform, it was people running enterprise software on an open operating system. So they were wanting to bring their Oracles, their WebSpheres, their DB2s, but run it on an open platform. What we saw sort of 2-3 years ago was an explosion of people wanting to run the likes of Mongo, Postgres, Node, you name it, the poster child group within the open source community. And what they were looking for was some of the natural characteristics that we just see as the mainframe: performance, availability, scale, security. Those kind of 4 tenets, if you will, of the mainframe platform. So what we were keen to do is find a natural home within the open source community where those players could come together and collaborate.
Right.
So we approached the Linux Foundation, which is kind of where the industry tends to gather. The Linux Foundation do a great job of kind of hosting and being that neutral third party. So we approached them, and they've got a collaborative project structure with it. I think it's almost approaching 30 collaborative projects now, everything from the Open Container Initiative through OpenStack, through the Open Drone Project, automotive-grade Linux. There's a number of collaborative projects. So we approached the Linux Foundation to really try and give us a natural home and for them to be a steward for us. So 2 years ago, in August, we launched the Open Mainframe project, and I've got the real pleasure of sitting on the board for that as IBM's representative.
Fantastic.
And we've got clients on the board with us. We've got academic institutions. We've got software vendors. We've got business partners. There's a whole sort of smorgasbord, if you will, of people involved in and caring about pushing forward Linux on this platform. So we've had people like Docker just recently join us. Ubuntu are there, SUSE, as I say, clients such as ADP, the largest user of Linux on the platform, actually the world's 7th largest managed service provider, if you believe some of the reports, and they run their business on Linux. So 1 in 7 paychecks in the US is generated by ADP.
Wow.
And that runs on a Linux platform on the mainframe. So, just that natural home for Linux and collaboration. So the ability to bring together what sometimes might be competitors to develop and collaborate and bring forward new open source projects that ultimately find themselves onto GitHub, but do that in an open collaborative way with the Linux Foundation as our natural home. So the Open Mainframe project's been a really exciting couple of years. We've more than doubled the membership. We've taken 8 interns through last year, and we've got another 8 starting their projects in the next week or so. So really a sort of broad objectives there to really push forward Linux on the platform.
And I think the thing we've seen from IBM, and this definitely fits into that worldview that I'm getting now, where IBM's an old, long, solid brand, and often when people look at that, if it isn't, like you said, the poster child of the Web 2.0 sort of cloudy space, people looking and go, oh, well, it's been around for a long time and it's old, but there's, it's a brand that just continually reinvents itself and continually disrupts itself. And when you hear you talk about you talk about this sort of stuff where it's open source on mainframe, when it's open technologies on mainframe, that you've approached the Linux Foundation, what we're really hearing is that a company that's been running for decades and decades and decades is reinventing itself and adopting new design patterns, new design principles, new methodologies, adopting that whole open source space. I remember when at the first day at Interconnect in Las Vegas, in fact, we called it Day Zero because Day 1, 2, 3 was sort of the traditional IBM event. But Day Zero, there was an open tech sort of mini forum for a day, and it was all the open source community sort of coming together around what was happening with the event. And I was talking to dozens and dozens of folk just trying to get the general sense of, what they thought of it. What was interesting was lots of people were really positively surprised to see a company like IBM adopting all this. And I said, well, but they've been doing this for decades, And so I think it's a really healthy thing to see a large organization going to the likes of these open source communities, particularly the Linux Foundation, and getting that stewardship. I remember talking to Joe Speeds from the IBM Watson Auto Labs IoT team, and he said something very similar, that when he first got into his role there, he realized there was a whole bunch of technology and IP that was within IBM that only IBM could get access to. And so he spent a couple of years of his role just getting out there and looking at taking some of that tech and giving it away for free and opening it and making sure that MQTT and other things were available to the whole planet as a good standard. And I think this is what we're really saying here, that you've got this very solid foundation of hardware. You've got a good operating system platform in the mainframe software stack. But now you're bringing in the likes of open technologies like Linux, and I know that Spark and Hadoop and MongoDB and some of these things. I mean, when people look at new software stacks, they don't often start thinking mainframe. But the reality is, it's there, it's solid, it's stable. And when you've got companies like Tesco and you're talking about ADP running 1 in 7 payrolls, people go home on a Friday with a paycheck, and they probably don't know that it's come out of an open platform on an open source tool set with a mainframe, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you look at our general manager, Ross Morey. Ross was the chair of the Linux Foundation before it was the Linux Foundation. So open source is baked into his DNA. You talk about the other IBM you mentioned talking about open sourcing technology. Ross was instrumental in a huge donation. I think it probably the second largest donation IBM's made to open source after Eclipse, with what we donated with the anomaly detection engine.
Right.
So we gave up IBM intellectual property to the Linux and open source community. It's up there on GitHub. It's being pushed forward by the community now around anomaly detection. So something we're particularly focused on is high availability.
Yeah.
So we wanted to bring that to the open source community in general. Our labs had been working on operational analytics software that looked for abnormal patterns. So that anomaly detection software, that 70,000 lines of code, we felt was to the betterment of the industry as a whole. That's now up on GitHub. You go to the Open Mainframe Projects repo on GitHub, you'll see the anomaly detection. You can get access to that code,
right,
and push it forward with the rest of the community. So I think people would be surprised by that sentence or set of sentences and wouldn't associate that with the mainframe business. But certainly Linux, it's, I think, now approaching just over 30% of the mainframe installations in the world also run Linux on those platforms. It's the fastest growing part of our business if you look at it.
Reminds me as a lifetime Trekkie of the Vulcan line that the needs of one, or rather the needs of many will outweigh the needs of one, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's if you can crowdsource development, and that's really what the open source community is all about, being able to get people in their dorm rooms. So just to give you an example, you look at the Open Mainframe Project intern program last year. We had one of the college students from Vietnam port Alpine Linux onto the platform. Now, if anybody knows their Docker, the distribution that's embedded in Docker is Alpine Linux as a really cut down distro. So that intern now has gone back to college, and he's the maintainer of that code base as we look to move forward with Docker on the platform. So it's a real meritocracy out there in the open source community. This kid picked it up as his project. He's now the industry expert on Alpine Linux running on the Mainframe platform.
Wow.
And is the maintainer of that code base. So there's lots of other IBMers supporting him, but he's the expert now, and really sort of bubbled to the top in the technical community. And that's how you need to crowdsource this development and crowdsource. There'll be people who've got a particular interest, a particular piece of this technology is going to keep them up at night coding till the early hours. And you need to harness that and get all of the eyeballs of the huge open source community, but bring that into the mainframe context. So where IBM's particularly focused is these 4 tenets. Yep. Performance, availability, security, and scale. So you'll see us pushing the open source community forward in those 4 key areas.
And it's interesting that, if we unbundle that for a moment, because there are a couple of amazing eureka moments. I mean, you had an intern, came out of college, got a tenure with IBM. You gave him a fun project. That fun project is a foundational component of containerization and orchestration and the whole DevOps space, and it runs on Mainframe. And I mean, that's a T-shirt in itself, and it's an amazing concept to think about. That other organizations might just faint at the mere idea of having an intern build some foundational piece of it, and yet here we've got an organization saying, we've got an intern, they're very passionate about it, they're willing, as you said, willing to stay up all night and work on it, but they're also good at it, and now they're effectively the maintainer of the project, and it's probably sitting in GitHub, and away they go. And yet in a year's time, some bank will deploy a new ATM system for card scanning for FPOS and terminals and automatic teller machines, built on this in a container on Alpine Linux, under Docker, running on Mainframe and Linux, and have absolutely no idea how that came about, and frankly not even need to know, right? So that leads us to the whole Linux One thing. I mean, we've sort of spoken broadly about cloud and kind of what it means in the Z cloud and what you're driving with. We've talked about sort of the Open Mainframe project, which is the foundational piece of creating an open platform. You're also in the world of Linux One and the whole transition of Linux on the mainframe in a proper sense, and it's come from a whole range of different pieces of work, from the relationship with SUSE, and now you mentioned that Ubuntu's on board. Just give us a quick summary of what Linux One actually is. Where did it come from? What is it? And kind of where is it fitting in the big puzzle now, this sort of whole stack of cloud open mainframe, sort of, Linux and then the ecosystem in general?
So Linux One is really focused on how do we bring those fundamentals of some of the mainframe design, those tenets around performance, availability, security, and scale, to that Linux world. So how do we build that Linux-only environment, but focusing on those areas? So the design point for Linux One is really to push on some of those extremes,
right?
Push on extremes of compute, performance, drive availability for people, to places, recovery point and recovery time objectives that they'd struggle to hit, push beyond 5 nines availability, deliver security. So just give you an example. So IBM's high security business network for blockchain runs on a Linux One platform. So blockchain, probably the coolest, hottest hashtag you can attach to a tweet right now. Every time I tweet about blockchain, I end up with another 5 or 6 followers. So there's a huge industry buzz around blockchain. But when IBM was looking for a technology to support that blockchain deployment in the cloud, they focused on Linux One. And why is that? It's just this ability, as we're building trusted networks and business networks where people connect and build the supply chains of the future, build the banking systems of the future, they're still going to need the same capabilities and the same functionality, and that same maniacal focus on security, availability, performance, and scale. So Linux One harnesses the best of the mainframe platform and brings that to a Linux Linux deployment.
Right.
So you look at IBM messaging heavily at interconnectors you would have seen around blockchain. You trace that back to where it sits in a data center and what it actually runs on. It's running on a Linux One machine that shares a lot of its DNA with the same core banking systems that is running on those mainframe deployments. So it's a Linux-only deployment. It's not running any of the legacy operating systems, but it is certainly delivering on those core capabilities that lots of clients are looking for. So, if you're looking to deploy Mongo at absolute scale, you don't want to shard the database across thousands of servers, and you want to deliver that Mongo database at absolute scale. Some of our benchmarks would say that running that on a Linux One platform is certainly the best platform to do that. You want to write in Node.js, you want Ruby on Rails, you want to do a Hadoop project, you're keen on Spark. You want to do all of those things, but in an absolute mission-critical enterprise computing type environment.
Yeah.
Certainly recommend you look at Linux One.
You mentioned something interesting there that really I wrote down. It really hit a hot point for me. I mean, availability is, we make so many assumptions around availability that something's just going to be there. It makes me laugh because it reminds me when my kids think about Wi-Fi and they think it should just be everywhere and it should be free and it should just be like oxygen. Availability is one of those things that's just built into the DNA of some of the technologies we're talking about, but it isn't a given. And when you said, taking something beyond 5 nines, I was like, well, that's pretty brave, because if we put that in context, I mean, even 9, what we're talking about here is like the percentile of 100%, right? So like 2 nines is 99% uptime, which, off the top of my head, is like 3.6 odd days a year of outage. In other words, if you're aiming for 99% uptime on a platform of any form, which is pretty impressive in itself, you're really talking about no more than about 3.5 days a year where your system's allowed to be offline in a maintenance window, right? But 3 nines becomes even braver because it's, and again, it's like, it's what, 8.5, 8.7 hours or something like that. I can't do the math off the top of my head. I should do. I'm a data scientist. But anyway, 4 nines gets ridiculous because now you're under an hour. So if you're 99.99% uptime a year and a 365-day year, that's like 52 minutes of space where your system's allowed to be offline for any reason to do upgrades and patches and maintenance and reinstallation. When you get to 5 nines, you take a whole zero off that effectively because you get to 5.2 minutes or something from memory. So when you say pushing something like Linux beyond 5 nines, I want to call that out because it's a pretty brave thing, and it's something that IBM and the mainframe platform take for granted. But if I sit in a workshop in a startup and I start talking about 2 or 3 nines, they start to get fidgety. When I talk about 5 nines, and the idea, they go, oh, it's all DevOps as availability, but Amazon's been offline and Twitter's been offline, and all these public clouds, they have downtime, but you can't do that in your world, can you? I mean, when you say pushing beyond 5 nines, I mean, if we go to 6 nines, that's like 31 seconds of outage a year.
I mean, we've got clients who talk about their environments and the last unplanned, and this is the distinction, it's planned and unplanned.
Right.
So,
yep.
It's, you may schedule an outage window, but it's that also the concept of unplanned outages. So when I talk about 5 nines, I'm talking about planned and unplanned.
Yep.
You can upgrade a mainframe system while it's still doing processing. All of these components are hot swappable and able to be, taking processor boards out, memory boards, I/O boards, whilst the system's still up and running. That's, put that in context and of an analogy, that's doing a heart and lung transplant on somebody whilst they're running a marathon.
Yeah. Well, when did you last open up your personal computer at home and rip out the RAM and swap in faster RAM or new RAM? I mean,
yes. Whilst you're doing a Skype call to Australia,
well,
that's the context. And so I think for me, one of the interesting things is, why do people get out of bed in the morning in Poughkeepsie and other mainframe labs around the world? I'm a huge fan of Simon Sinek's TED Talk on this concept of why.
Right.
And baked into the DNA of an IBMer who's on the mainframe platform is this maniacal focus on availability performance, handling, scale, and security. We're maniacally obsessed on those four things at the extreme. Now, that's not saying that the guys in the lab at Intel and the guys working on software for Microsoft and the guys in Oracle aren't focused, but they're focused on a more general set of computing requirements.
Right.
The guys in Intel developing chips, those chips will find themselves in a PC. They'll find themselves in a mid-range server. They'll find themselves in a high-end server. We're only focused on the computing at the absolute extreme.
Yeah.
So when clients come to us, they tap into that DNA, and when they're wanting an environment that needs to operate in the extreme, that's where we can help them with what we design.
Well, I remember doing a survey as early as 2015. IDC drove the thing, and I got on the back of the tail of it and ran a local one here in Australia because the IDC one was predominantly North American focused. And I think IDC surveyed something like 350 CIOs in the US just around their technology stack and what software they're running. And one of the takeaways I pulled out of it with the context of today was that, but they were all using big data and they're all using cloud. And one of the things that jumped off the page at me was like, well, hang on a second. Those 350 CIOs running mainframes, that's probably more than the total number of large Hadoop clusters on the planet. There's lots and lots of hundreds of little tiny Hadoop clusters of 3 and 6 and 12 and 32 machines, but not at this scale, right? And, when we see the likes of Spark coming out now on hardware on the Z13, which I'd like to ask you about in a second, all of a sudden there's no reason not to consider that as a platform. And you're right about the DNA piece of kind of, your four core tenets of performance and scale and security and availability. And, it's in context in the world where you're running an airline or running a bank. There are things that you need to worry about. But the other end of the spectrum, yesterday I was in a meeting with somebody and going through a PowerPoint, normally those 350 odd CIOs actually still owned and maintained. It automatically done an update in the background and rebooted itself. And it just reminded me that, there's teams around the world who, yes, they're still focused on quality and still focused on various things, but it's apparently okay in their mind that if you're in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation and a 1-hour meeting with a CEO, that an update can automatically happen and reboot your computer, and to hell with everyone else. So I love the idea that you've taken this open platform around the open mainframe space. I love the idea you've taken the whole Linux and open source space. Now you're baking in that capability, and I'm fascinated with the idea of going beyond 5 nines. What does the future of the whole Linux One thing look like, just in a couple of minutes? From today onwards, what are some of the things that we can expect to see out of Linux One over the next sort of 2, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think you're going to see more and more Linux deployments require those capabilities. So as Linux kind of moves from the edges towards the core of organizations, as that the benefits of crowdsourced development kind of find their way towards the core of computing environments, these systems of engagement, people are going to wake up and say, okay, it's a open source developed application running on a set of open source middleware, running on a Linux distro.
Yeah.
But I still want it to be performant, I still want it to be available, I still want it to be secure. I still want all of those characteristics. I want to harness that open source and crowdsourced development because those are the new cool things I need. But it's got to work, and it's got to work every day. It's got to be tamper-proof. It's got to be encrypted. It's got to be secure. It's got to be able to scale, to the absolute extremes. It's got to be able to handle Cyber Mondays and Black Fridays and all of these spikes. So I want the best of both worlds. I want the tagline for Linux One back when it was launched was Linux without limits.
I like that.
It sounds cheesy, and it's a tagline, and it was created by some bright guys in our marketing department. But that's really where I'd sort of focus people's minds. It's Linux, but you haven't got those limits. You haven't got those architectural limits. You haven't got those challenges to architect around to drive availability, performance, scale, and security.
Yeah, and each of those underpinning foundational tenets are things that we we really need to start assuming are baked in, because I think when we look at, you talked about security, you talked about some of the challenges that we're facing now around data leaks, data breaches. In the UK recently, there was TalkTalk, who is like a VoIP phone provider and whatnot. They had 157,000 of their customers have all their data breached, not just their basic usernames, passwords. And yesterday we saw a platform called Edmodo, which is an online web-based education and training, and sort of like a dumbed-down Twitter and Facebook for kids. 90-odd thousand records lost, full dump. But we're not now talking about you and I with a credit card or something trivial that a bank can hedge against and just self-fund the insurance. We're talking about my 12-year-old son, for example, who has an Edmodo account. His first name, last name, email address, and anything else around the profile is now out there, and you can never unwind that, right? Now, I'm not poo-pooing the sort of what's happening at the bleeding edge of public cloud and hybrid cloud, but I am certainly not happy about the fact that I get an email from Edmodo saying that my son, who's 12, has had his data breached from their platform. And the greatest thing they can do from that is ask us to reset the password, right? That just doesn't wash in this space, and particularly, when we're rushing quickly at all these new exciting technologies. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the general sense of the ecosystem around the mainframe space that you're in. I mean, when we think about the global offering manager of Z Cloud or Z Cloud as your job title, it's a very broad thing. But if we sort of skip from cloud to sort of the open mainframe and then Linux one into the broad ecosystem of mainframe, what's the breadth and scope of that whole ecosystem? I mean, what is if you were to walk into a room and do a speed date introduction, how would you describe that entire mainframe ecosystem in today's context? What does it sound like and look like?
Well, you've got everything from some of the biggest providers of compute and storage technology as ecosystem partners, the likes of EMC and HDS, Brocade and Cisco. From the hardware connect type perspective, you've got over 100 probably mainframe software developers, the likes of the big names like CA and BMC and CompuAir and SAS, Software AG. Yeah, the that people would associate with. But then you've got this huge plethora of open source providers. So Ubuntu, Red Hat, SUSE. You've got Mongo, Postgres, Cassandra, Elk, Ruby on Rails. I just could reel them off. All of that open source sort of cool kids, as you will, in the industry. OpenStack running on the platform. So I think the ecosystem for me is probably as broad as it could be. One of the things that I find interesting is, people talk about the mainframe as a closed proprietary system that only comes from IBM, and they kind of throw that back at us as an objection. Well, x86 runs two operating system main flavors. It runs Windows and it runs Linux. Well, we run Linux, we run TPF, we run VSE, we run ZOS.
Yep.
So yes, most of those operating systems come from IBM, but you can also run open source on this platform. So I think, yes, we're the provider of the hardware, but we've got people whose job title it is and get out of bed every morning trying to promote the ecosystem on the platform.
Yeah.
We've got a VP whose role it is, a huge team of 60 plus people who focus on open source development on the platform, from engaging with the open source community, a wider Linux industry team that we draw on. So there's a huge team focused on developing and pushing forward this ecosystem.
Right.
So thinking of it as a closed proprietary technology, I just don't get out of bed and think of it that way at all. I think of it as a something that's driven by IBM to a set of sort of technical specs and driven to a market requirement, but then is also exposed out to a huge ecosystem of providers who then build on top of what IBM develops and take it into new spaces. So, Spark running on ZOS, not just on Linux on the platform. So being able to run Spark, providing that analytics and some of that big data at the point of impact. So running, for instance, analytics on yesterday's data is mildly interesting.
Yeah.
Being able to run analytics whilst I'm standing at the point of sale and say, would you like fries with that? And it not just be the generic question of would you like fries with that, but actually what's showing up is somebody knows I've ordered fries the last 3 times I was at the point of sale, but I've not got fries in front of me today.
Yeah.
Being able to actually drive those types of purchase and upsell decisions because you've got the data presented at the point of impact. That's what we can do by performance and availability and scale, but also leveraging things like Spark on the platform.
And it's interesting, it's important to call out that when you said you're running Spark on the platform and you're running it natively on the mainframe operating system, you don't have to run it inside Linux, you don't have to run it on some other operating system. And you've ported Spark to the native platform. It runs essentially in the DNA of the mainframe OS. And, I think that's something that probably gets skipped over. I mean, when you think about the TPC capabilities, the processing grunt that comes with the mainframe DNA and the mainframe pedigree, to port something like Stream Analytics on something like Spark directly to the mainframe natively is a quantum leap ahead of kind of what's happening on some of the other platforms where maybe just 1 or 2 things are being ported. And I'm imagining it wasn't an intern that did it, like the Alpine thing.
It was a big team. It was a big team for sure.
But when you think about the context of porting something like Spark to mainframe native, and as you said, it's a big team. Somebody had to sit there and go, well, what new technologies should we be putting on this stack inside this ecosystem, and then approach the open source community that build that. And essentially sell the idea and then get them on board and get them running with it. Because I think a lot of people forget that open source, even though there's a whole bunch of us around the world that write tools, codes, scripts, whatever, and we open source them, that for the better part of the bulk of people working on open source, they actually work for companies like IBM and they get a salary and they've got permission to work on open source stuff and the code base for streaming analytics on the mainframe platform natively that have made its way back into the code base and back into GitHub, that when someone does a build and a make, it benefits other chipsets. And
definitely, I mean, just to stop and dive in there, Des, we did a call recently with the Open Mainframe project. It's about a year ago now, maybe even longer than that, with Greg Coa-Hartman.
Right.
If anybody, if you're a Linux guy, he's kind of next down from Linus in the pecking order. So he's the kernel maintainer. One of the gods of the open source community.
Yeah.
So we did a call with him, a just general Q&A, and he said it was interesting because he made exactly the same point that you made, that when IBM's kind of taking the kernel and running it on the mainframe, we're running it in a way that highlights some of the deficiencies. So when he gets code back from the IBMers who work in an open source space, it's adding to the overall code base of that Linux kernel. Because we're pushing it on the extremes, pushing it for availability, pushing it for security, looking at some of those things and turning and this will appeal to you, turning the dial to 11, the sort of the spinal tap kind of reference. But when we're turning that dial to 11 for some of the workloads that we run, we find things that just the general purpose computing guys don't find.
Yeah.
And then we contribute them back to the betterment of the overall Linux kernel as it moves forward. So that was a really interesting point that Greg made that kind of stopped us all on the call and went, if that's the owner of the Linux kernel saying that unprompted about the contributions he gets back from IBM, that really kind of goes back to this, why do we get out of bed in the morning, this kind of Simon Sinek, what's the why that gets you out of bed and brings you to work every day. That's really that focus within IBM on some of those extremes.
And we should put Greg Crow, I can never pronounce his last name right, Crow-Hartman in context here. I mean, you mentioned that he's like essentially the second god of Linux. I mean, here's a guy who's I mean, he's essentially a Linux kernel developer at the high level, but I mean, he's the maintainer of the stable branch of the entire stack, plus other subsystems. I mean, everything from and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but across everything from the USB interconnectivity and drivers. He's got debug file system, all the way up to text terminal drivers. And so this guy's the part of the DNA of the operating system. If he's sitting up and saying, we're seeing good things come back from your code. I mean, I don't think there's any higher, positive comment in that you could possibly get. A higher praise is the phrase I was looking for, barring Linus saying something, and then he's often a bit of a grumpy fellow anyway. But
you can say that, I can't.
No, I can say that. And look, we all love him and love what he does, but he does tend to fire from the hip. But if Greg's saying that about what you're doing, then that is the single highest praise in that space. And here's a guy that's come through. Where did he start? Like Novell from memory, and then he's gone through SUSE, and I think he's inside the Linux Foundation directly now, isn't he, from memory?
Yeah, he's a fellow of the Linux Foundation,
yeah.
So I think he's full time working for those guys. So he's not beholden to. He doesn't pick a paycheck up from anybody else. So I think that was also kind of what resonated for me, and a lot of people sort of question Linux on the mainframe. Oh, you must do something special to it. It must be a different flavor of Linux.
Right.
It must be some kind of weird emulated offshoot of Linux. But then, on that call with Greg, he was saying, no, it's the kernel. It's the same kernel that everybody else runs. And you look at chatting to the guys at Ubuntu. I mean, they've got out of the phone business now, but it was exactly the same Linux running on a phone, a PC, an enterprise x86 box, and the mainframe. It was Ubuntu on all of those platforms. So it's Linux. One of the phrases our guys tend to use is, it's Linux, it's Linux, it's Linux.
Yeah.
You almost need the repetition to get across the point of, no, it's not anything weird. It is Linux, and it just runs natively on our platform.
Developers will get the reference to a Microsofter that might have stood on stage going, developers, 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 developers. But it's Linux and it's Linux and it's Linux. And, we've seen it running on smartwatches. We've seen it running on calculators. It's in damn cars. It's in airplanes. It's in ships. It's in autonomous vehicles. And it's on mainframe. And I think the thing that a lot of people don't appreciate was when we talk about Linux, we're talking about Linux, the kernel itself that drives the operating system, essentially the DNA and the heart and soul of it and the mind of it. And then it's wrapped up in a whole bunch of good free software from all different walks of life for everything from file systems, because there's more than one file system you can run on the Linux kernel. There's lots of free software, all these different distros. So in many ways, what you've really done is effectively created a mainframe distro in the same way that there's Fedora and Red Hat Enterprise, and there's Ubuntu, and there's we spoke about Alpine, and there's Debian, and there's dozens of them, right? And but it doesn't change the code base, right? It's just that you port it, you put it on your compiler, and you make a binary, and you run it and install it, right?
Yeah, I think, and don't quote me on the exact percentage, but I think it's about just under 3% difference. And that difference will be device drivers.
Yeah.
So obviously what the operating system calls to complete its compute and I/O and storage. So really those kind of, how do you go fetch a piece of data? How do you compute?
Yeah.
How do you finish a calculation? Those device drivers, and those will change whether you're running it on a watch, on a phone, on a PC, on an enterprise server anyway. Those device drivers will change. So that's all that changes when you take Linux and run it on the mainframe platform. It's about just under 3%.
Right, and that's no different from anywhere else, right? As you said, if you port Linux to a small device like a watch, it doesn't need to know how to talk to a line printer potentially, or it doesn't need to know how to talk to a 3270 terminal emulation. It's just talking to a tiny 400 by 300 pixel screen. I would say for every platform, as far as I'm concerned, having been in the space myself for a long time, every single platform I've ever seen where Linux is ported to. The piece that changes is how you get the device drivers interfaces talking to something that's specific on that platform. But the operating system doesn't really change. Or if you do find a patch or a fix, you roll it up into the core code base and someone approves it, and then it comes back to you and you compile it, right? A lot of new startups and a lot of new companies don't really fully appreciate when we say ecosystem in an organization like IBM and many of your brethren in that sort of rarefied air of a very, very large company. The ecosystem is everything from the DNA, the brand itself, IBM, all the way to its partners and integrators and independent software vendors and resellers and channel partners and developers and then open sourcing. It's almost a case where something the size of IBM. I mean, the tendrils reach into all kinds of interesting places that we don't expect. And I'm always fascinated when I talk to firms, and next thing they say, "Oh, and by the way, that we're an IBM partner," and it's like, "Oh, of course you are." But I mean, the ecosystem that give us a visual, if you can, of the scope of what that ecosystem looks like. Because I think many people listening probably don't fully appreciate what not just your role as global offering manager for Z Cloud means, but the ecosystem that you're part of and that drives all of that around the world across different platforms and different systems that talk to your environment.
So just let's look on this week. 3 independent software vendors. So as we approach clients as they look to make the transition from on-premise single-tenant mainframe to a multi-tenant mainframe off-premise in the cloud, that's an impact on how they license particular software that runs on their mainframe. So just this week alone, 3 calls with senior VPs within mainframe software vendors about how we manage that transition as to support our mutual clients. So in some cases, IBM is competing with that software vendor.
Right.
And so it's a co-opetition type model where we're working together for the betterment of our clients, but in another part of our business we're competing, tooth and nail for the client's spend on software. So, it's a real evolved model. So I'm talking about striking strategic partnerships with mainframe software vendors, and another part of IBM's looking to kind of gouge the eyes out of those software vendors. So right. that really sort of gives a dynamic there.
Yeah.
Earlier this week, as part of the Open Mainframe project, collaborating with HDS, how do we go and push forward on some of the new innovative technologies that are coming through in the storage space? So, IBM collaborating in the open source community with HDS, and then only earlier today talking to the CEO of a business partner who's looking to resell our Z Cloud capability. So
right.
that CEO is seeing the shift to the cloud, wanting to transform his business so that he can support where his clients are wanting to go, and talking to him about how we enable this offering to be sold via his business and him wrap additional value for his clients, leveraging his skill base and his knowledge and his organization's kind of core competencies around my core offering. So, I mean, that's just 1 week, and it's been a relatively quiet week. Some would argue it's certainly not the same week as Interconnect a few weeks ago, but
no.
That's just a number of ISVs, number of different business partners. So that's just the scale and breadth and depth of what it means for me as an offering manager to be working within IBM and kind of operating this ecosystem. IBM's not the only game in town for these clients, and nor should we think we are. We bring additional value when we partner. So it's really how do we do that best for our clients.
I think, once upon a time there was a phrase that no one got fired for buying IBM. That phrase doesn't really have any context now because, as you said, CIOs and whomever else in the organization, they're making decisions on technologies based on a whole range of different drivers. Database is a database in many ways, but there are different types of databases. There's NoSQL and SQL, and there's databases are designed for time series type data sets, and there's databases just designed for basic, field and row and record and table for a CRM or HR platform. And when they go and choose those technologies, they then maybe go further down the stack and they find a partner of IBM, and then they might find a hardware platform to go. So I think I think the challenge for that ecosystem now is what you're already addressing around the staying current, staying relevant, driving innovation, getting involved in that whole open source crowdsourcing space that everyone's moving towards. And I don't think there's going to be a collapse of the proprietary software market. I think it's just a shift in engagement. I don't think all software is going to be free one day, but I certainly think we've seen a shift to that. Although had somebody come up with Spark and made a proprietary version, I imagine it would have had relatively similar adoption. In closing, what I'd really love you to do is give us a 3 to 5 minute summary of where you think Mainframe's going to be, crystal ball gazing, and we won't hold you to it. If you were going to give us a view of where this whole space you're in around IBM and the transition to the cloud, cloud style of business, if we say, the cloud approach, the what used to call utility computing, just pay as you go, where the whole open mainframe space is going, any impact that Linux One's going to have on that. If you were to look over the horizon and say in 3 to 5 years, this is where we'll be, off the top of your head, what does that even remotely look like? Is that possible to sort of scope that out? Or where will we be in 3 years? Where will we be in 5 years? And what does that look like, particularly in the context of your role and where you are inside IBM?
Well, I mean, you're going to, in this sort of early part of the next, of that time horizon, you're going to see IBM bringing to bear our next latest system. So that's going to be the next sort of quantum leap in computing, leveraging, again, those 4 key tenets, particularly security, availability, scale, and performance. So just pushing further on that envelope. So, I have the pleasure of sitting in the lab and seeing the guys get excited as they push towards that next kind of release of the technology. So that's going to shape the near-term horizon. And then I think you're going to see just a continual move towards the platform of some of these open source type environments. As open source matures and starts to move towards the core, it's going to need some of those key tenets of what the mainframe's designed for.
Yeah.
So those are things I'd see. And then you're going to see this push to more consumption-based models, people wanting not only their core mainframe workloads delivered on the cloud, but also microservices. You've seen blockchain as a first example of that. Other microservices built on this architecture that are specifically designed that need those characteristics that I've talked about throughout this session. So if there's a service that needs particular security, that I could envisage on the platform, particular maybe databases or data analytics type capabilities that are delivered as a microservice, via Bluemix in a public cloud, and people don't realize that they're consuming a workload that's ultimately running on a mainframe architecture. So I'd see that. I'd see clients deploying private clouds. So some of our largest clients are maybe never going to make that transition to the public cloud, even for mainframe on my space. So they're going to be wanting to deploy private clouds, leveraging all the same technology I'm leveraging in the public space to deliver a mainframe cloud, but do that on premise.
Right.
So you're going to see, I think, some of the smaller clients moving towards an off-premise model. Some of the bigger clients are going to continue to evolve and stay where they are from a private cloud perspective.
Right.
So I think microservices, Linux, open source, and then just this move from private or public cloud. That's what I'd see over that next 3 to 5 years.
And thanks for that great over the horizon view, because I agree with all those points you just made. We've got big things like GDPR coming along out of Europe, and we used to have the EU-US data shield, but that really was a toothless tiger in my view. Now that GDPR is becoming, it's been around for 12 years, but now that it's becoming an empowered regulatory framework, and you can be fined up to, I think it's like 20 million euros or 4% of your last year's gross turnover on a per code a single breach talking about that, because I think your core tenant says it's 150,000 multiplied by either 20 million euros or 4% of your last year's turnover. People are going to start looking, saying, okay, well, we now need to have a really serious think about where we put the stuff, because where can we find these key things you're talking about? So that sort of, security and privacy is a given. And when we think about cloud and certainly what's happening around smart infrastructure, smart cities, autonomous vehicles, and IoT, again, the scale at which IoT is going to impact the planet, I really, I refuse to believe that very few people fully understand the impact of IoT. I like using the example of the Boeing Dreamliner 787 when it first came out, and they declared that this airplane generated 0.5 terabyte of data per flight. So I did some quick math, and as an example, when I do public speaking occasionally, I draw this picture where it says, here's a Dreamliner 787 released a number of years ago. It generates 0.5 terabyte of data. This thing's got 4,000 IoT-styled sensors in the wings and the body. It collects data in real time. If we look at the domestic airspace of the US alone, there's 87,400 flights a day. Now, the FAA has decreed that by 2018, I think it's March or April 2018, every aircraft and every airline has to have their infrastructure and their airlines and aircraft up to the same level of BIOS, if you like, as the Dreamliner 787. So do the math, 87,400 flights a day in the domestic airspace in the US, generating 0.5 terabyte data. That's 43.5 petabytes of data. Now, that was a really big, scary number, but Airbus wasn't going to be outdone, because they came out with one that's got like 10 or 12,000 sensors. So if you end up with the same level of BIOS as that airplane and the same math, now you got 22 petabytes of data a day. This is not going to happen in the public cloud, right?
No.
It's just, and people talk about, Yahoo's got 110 petabytes, or someone, Facebook 140 petabytes. So, well, that's 3 days worth of processing in the old school aeroplane alone. In the latest BIOS of the airplanes, let's say from Airbus, the domestic airspace is 220 petabytes a day. Now, obviously, we're not going to capture and collect it all, but you've still got to process it. So I can see that, out of your core tenets around security and protection and privacy and so forth, GDPR is just going to wake a lot of people up. The IoT is going to be this big bloody nose that everyone's going to have, because we're creating sensors on everything, but no one's thought about how it's going to go across the network, where you're going to collect and aggregate it, where you're going to do that analytics. And then when you think about the next big thing you mentioned, which is blockchain, again, it's another massive thing that I don't think that everyone's going to have to understand blockchain, because it's going to be built into the DNA in the same way that SSL is with TCP/IP and web sessions to a bank. But the people making the systems and building the software are going to have to think about it, because all of a sudden we're going to change the way that the design patterns are put in place. And when you create a web connection, SSL may no longer be relevant. Maybe use blockchain for some of that underpinning logging and tracking. So I think it's an interesting time, and your takeaways are really relevant around the next 3 to 5 years. And I suspect we've got another 2 or 3 shows ahead of us talking on just those key things. So why don't we wind it up there and schedule ourselves some more time to catch up some of those big points. But really exciting to hear what's happening around just the IBM ecosystem, what you're doing in the cloud and the open mainframe space, and particularly Linux and Linux One, and in your role of global offering manager of the Z Cloud. I can only imagine what's over the horizon for you. So Stephen Dickens, thanks so much for making time available. It's been fantastic to have you on the podcast, and I hope we have the pleasure of having you on the air again soon.
Yeah, look, it's been great to talk, Des, and really keen to talk again in the future. So just thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, you're most welcome, and thanks for making time. And we will definitely do follow-ups, and we'll turn it into a series. So look, I hope you have a fantastic evening. It's going to be a great day in my sense. And folks, if you're listening, I hope you've gotten a great deal from that. And we'll definitely get Stephen Dickens, the Global Offering Manager for Z Cloud at IBM, on the air again soon, talking about some of these other topics. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again.